Welcome. I'm Josh O'Brien, and this is the first episode of the Learn, Think, Build podcast. Our first guest this maiden voyage is my brother-in-law, Mr. Frank Morano. Frank's a radio talk show host on WABC in New York, and he's the producer of the documentary Get Me Roger Stone. Frank, thank you for being on.
It's an honor to be your first guest. I love learning, thinking, and building. I could probably do a little bit more of all three. I'm excited to do some learning here with you. I appreciate you coming all the way out to make the trip to Staten Island, which is the world capital of learning, thinking, and building.
Is that true? I didn't know that.
That's right. Certified as such.
Well, we're in Frank's home here, so thank you for having me as your guest. This is what? You've been here for a week and a half?
2 weeks, and they said it wouldn't last. So it's been a terrific 2 weeks, but we have not yet filmed a podcast here, which is the one thing we've been missing. So excited to do this.
That's exciting. So episode 1, very, very important. And what's more important to talk about than the virus? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's not waste any time. First thing first, all right, I want to get through a couple of interesting tidbits here. First thing is that at the world level, at the global level, there's been a big plan in the works for some time now to create what people have been referring to as the Great Reset. So the Great Reset, and Frank has mentioned he's heard about this. Brandon, our film guy, has heard about this as well. The Great Reset is a plan to change the way we live in this world. The Great Reset is a plan to change industry. It's a plan to change money. It's a plan to change just about everything. And we're really going to get into it because I think that's got a lot to do with at least how we're responding to this virus. So the first thing I want to get into is the head of the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is sort of a global entity along with the International Monetary Funds, the World Bank, the United Nations. These are sort of global players, power players in the world. We've heard about them. We don't always know what they do. So today we're going to get into what they do and what it seems they're planning. All right, so first I want to kick things off with a quote from Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab is the gentleman has 2 PhDs and a master's degree. He's got a PhD in, and this is why this is interesting, in economics. He's got a PhD in engineering and a master's in public administration, which tells me he likes to engineer the economics of the public, which is essentially what they're doing. At least that's what he's trying to do. So I want to kick things off with a quote by Klaus Schwab. All right. Now, this gentleman, he's sort of behind this push to do what they're calling the Great Reset. All right, it's sort of his brainchild in its current form. He's written books on it. He's passionate about it. And he's really gotten the United Nations and all these other global entities in on sort of accepting this new direction that they want the world to head.
What is Klaus Schwab's job, or what does he do now?
Klaus Schwab essentially, right now, he's pushing for this Great Reset. That's what he does. That's sort of his brainchild. It's his baby. I think he's about 80 years old now, and he's been pushing for this hard for a while. So as of right now, I think he's fully committed to this. And what is he committed to? I want to mention a couple things, all right? So the Great Reset, or what they call the Fourth Industrial Revolution, is the incorporation of new technologies into how we live, how we work. There's an element of digitizing the money, all right? They want to get rid of paper money. And they're looking to add technology to jobs and thus remove a lot of the human element of these jobs that are done. And I want to read a quote by Klaus Schwab, and he's talking about the Great Reset. And what he said about the Great Reset, this fourth industrial revolution, is he said, it will not only change how we communicate, how we produce, how we consume, it will change actually us, our own identity, which not quite clear what that means, but let's get deeper into it. What they're pushing for here is really something that's good for these national banks, these world banks. It's good for corporations because the corporations get a slice of this new world they're trying to build. and all the very powerful people and global entities have something at stake here. The question is this good for us? And is it related to the virus in some way? So I'm going to read another quote by Klaus because he doesn't particularly couch his intentions. What he says here about the damage that the pandemic lockdowns have brought upon us, he talks about the rebuilding from the damage that we've sustained economically and general economic infrastructure from the lockdowns in response to the virus. And what he says is this. He said, rather than using funds as well as investments from private entities and pension funds to fill cracks in the old system, instead we should use them to create a new one that is more resilient, equitable, and sustainable in the long run. So he's looking for a lot of changes here. So far there's a question mark surrounding this. Are these changes good for us? Are they not so good for us? All right. He refers to this new economy that you're trying to build as a stakeholder economy. That goes back to what we said about the banks, the corporations. A lot of the big billionaires are behind this, right? So he refers to them as stakeholders, which is sort of telling, right? They're going to be gaining something from this. Again, they've got something at stake. They want to gain. This is the plan. The model's already been laid out. It's in the works. And they've been working on this for a while, this streamlining and adding of technology to industry and removal of people from those jobs. Another quote, this time not by Dr. Schwab, this is by President Trump. And this was a speech he gave to the United Nations in 2019. All right, and he's discussing the changes that the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and these other entities are looking to do. And what he said is this. He said, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. He didn't say the world. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. That means control over yourself, all right? And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people, not the world, and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists, it belongs to patriots. So you're getting a sense of what Trump's looking to do here. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special. So the reason Trump said this was that there's this international pressure from these big power players to make these big changes. And the reason Trump said this is that Klaus Schwab, when discussing the changes we're going to make in these jobs and industries, says very clearly the United States will lose about 50% of its jobs.
Wow.
That's half. That's why Trump responded by saying, if you want freedom, take pride in your country. And wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. It belongs to patriots. So what Trump is doing is he's defending the United States of America from this global push to change the way we work. Why? Because it's going to kill our economy in the short term.
So it sounds like at this point, based on where Klaus Schwab is and where Donald Trump is, you're much more closely aligned with the Trumpian view of the international order of things in the international economy than you are the Great Reset view of things.
I'm way more oriented towards Trump's defense of the nation because this is going to be catastrophic to the Americans that live in this country right now. I've had conversations with people about this economic reset. This might be a good thing in the future, but not right now for us. Maybe in 50 years or 30 years or in 100 years, this world is better. That world is better than this world is now. But they're stepping on the heads of modern America in 2020 in order to achieve that. All right. And what Trump did in the last 4 years of his presidency, and this is the platform on which he ran. He ran on the platform of a nationalistic president. And that means that he's looking out for the good of his nation in contrast to the good of the world, and is not willing to sacrifice the health and the well-being and the economic well-being of the United States in order to achieve that project in the future.
Right, or to benefit these international bankers that would benefit from the kind of reset that you're talking about.
I wonder why. All right, so that brings me to my next point, which is Trump rejected this, right? They had this big plan in place, and all the corporations, the banks, governments were behind this. There was a big plan in place, and the United States is a big player. And the United States pulled Trump pulled the U.S. out of this plan, which does a lot of damage to the plan. There's a lot less to be earned and gained by these other power players. So that brings me to the next point, which is Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. I recently read this. I think you said you haven't read this one,
Not
Frank?
yet, no, but based on what I've heard, it's something that seems very relevant, especially with what we're going through now. I'd like to read it.
Well, I'm going to read something here. So this is just sort of a description of, this is the gist of the book, all right, written by Naomi Klein. I think it's a wonderful book, very illuminating as to how these power players at the global level operate, all right, and not just global, they do this at the national level as well. And what she says is this: multinational corporations, these global corporations, big corporations, take advantage of disasters, they overthrow governments, to create an environment for the development of successful business operations in those countries. All right, so what they do is they disturb the existing order of things so they can move in with their economic model, their corporate structure, and continue to reap rewards from that region.
Give folks an example, if you could think of one, of an international corporation that actually would overturn or wreck a government for their own private interests.
Well, I'll give you a few really good examples from the book that Naomi goes into, which is, she talks about New Orleans. All right, so after Hurricane Katrina, and this is a really good example because it's close to home, New Orleans got wiped, right? It was underwater. So 18 months after Hurricane Katrina hit and the waters receded, the area of New Orleans that had been part of public housing, government public housing for low-income families, that area was sort of taken out from under the feet of the people that had lived there. And what transpired was that within 18 months of Hurricane Katrina, corporations got into the government, convinced the government to let them build condos where the public housing had existed. And what that did was two things. Number one, it robbed the homes of these people that previously lived there. They had nowhere else to go. Number two, it was a big money, corporate, financial benefit to these corporations. And it's sort of a small example, close to home, recent, of how this goes. But we did the same thing in Iraq. And of course, that was recent as well. They used the disaster, the catastrophe. One of the terms Naomi Klein uses in this book is called, she calls it disaster capitalism. Mm. All right, and that's exactly what they do. So they use the disaster of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, to go into Iraq. All right, and later on we found there was some questionable information. The intel we thought we had about why we went into Iraq later on turned out to be...
They're still looking for those weapons of mass destruction.
That's right. They're going to find them soon. Mm-hmm. So they went under the guise of weapons of mass destruction, and what did they do? They essentially wiped Iraq clean so they could build anew. And what they did was the U.S. government, U.S. contractors, a lot of corporations we've heard of. What they did was, excuse me, they basically robbed Iraq blind. They took a lot of their resources. They took a lot of natural resources, oil. They took utilities. And what they did was they stripped the country and went outside the borders and sold everything off. Mm. All right, and she details this in the book. What they also did was they built a new infrastructure in Iraq. And what did they build? They built their own corporate businesses and businesses that would produce money for them instead. They would bring in all sorts of TVs. They would bring in all sorts of satellite dishes. They brought in DVD players, selling this stuff to people that had lost their homes. They lost their government. And instead of setting up a proper infrastructure in these countries, they immediately went to the dollar and started trying to sell people things, essentially using these poor shocked citizens of this country as nothing more than patrons that they could sell things to.
So when we talk about the shock doctrine, is it something that is precipitated and conceived of by private business, or is it conceived of by government, or is it something that happens naturally and private business steps in to take advantage of?
That's a great question. So it seems the examples that Naomi Klein covers in her book, it's oftentimes a joint effort of the government and the corporations, which these days is sort of how we see things happening, right? We don't often see governments or corporations divorced from each other. Instead, they're sort of linked arm in arm, working together towards their common good. Not necessarily the good of the people, but together. And in fact, more of that exact same dynamic of the country working with the corporation in mutual benefit. When I say country, I mean the government. This is actually another thing that is called for in the Great Reset, more coordination among these entities. However, from what we've seen, that's not always good for the people. In fact, in some cases, it's often not. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting. And look, if you look at domestic crises that we're seeing, in the United States, for instance, healthcare has always been a big issue. And I was thinking as you were describing how this goes on, if you look at everybody having solutions about healthcare and this and that, when the great healthcare reform that we've had over the last 20 years was Obamacare, and what did it do? Is it created millions of new customers for private health insurance companies, paid for, if you couldn't afford it, by the U.S. taxpayer. So you have essentially a situation where you have this massive giveaway of the public treasury to private interests, and it's easy to see how the private companies benefit, and it's not necessarily as easy to see how individual Americans benefit. Like, obviously, if you didn't have healthcare and now you have it, certainly is good for you. But you could definitely see a lot of other healthcare plans that wouldn't have included this giveaway of public dollars to private interests that could have covered those same people. So it's easy to see that on the domestic stage, and it's very interesting when you compare that to what you're seeing on the international stage as well, whether you're talking defense contractors like like Blackwater, or other companies like Halliburton, or other companies like that get to have access to things like rare earths and mineral rights in some of these places. It's pretty disconcerting that when we talk about all these issues and things like presidential elections, that this is something that so rarely gets talked about.
That's right.
And so many of the conversations that we have about presidential elections, or any elections, but elections that we're told is the most important election in your lifetime, this and that, it always tends to revolve around poll numbers and candidate fundraising, and very little about how tax dollars are actually flowing to private interests and who's benefiting, right? Cui bono.
It's true. That was a great point. I knew there's a reason my sister married you.
I think she's still trying to figure that one out, but there you have it.
So I'm going to, I think one distinction between the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, being a money grab for the corporations, one of the distinctions between some of the examples given in the Shock Doctrine and something as obvious as that is that in the case of the examples given in the Shock Doctrine, a lot of these throwing these opportunities to corporations by the government are precipitated, to use your word, by disaster. And that brings me to the next point, was let's go into some of these examples, all right? We already sort of have the concept, but I want to go into a few more pertinent examples, and then commentary on it as well. In fact, let's start with that first. If you look at, where are we here?
It is interesting, in the recent economic crisis that we are living through as a result of this pandemic. What was the first thing that the Federal Reserve did? Is they injected hundreds of millions of dollars in liquidity into the financial markets.
Yes.
That you'd think if the Federal Reserve was going to create money out of thin air, maybe they'd give it to the small businesses that are having a difficult time paying their rent. But no, they gave it to Wall Street. So I think it really says a lot about where the real power is.
That says a tremendous amount. Always follow the money, right? The money doesn't lie.
Evidently.
Other examples of, like we mentioned New Orleans, we mentioned Iraq. This took place in Russia in the 90s, when Russia essentially collapsed, right? When the Soviet Union really disbanded and fell apart, they had some problems. They had economic problems and other problems. And these measures were unleashed on the Russian people. The government essentially created an opportunity for corporations to grab onto everything. And it really had a humongously heavy impact on the citizens. What Russia did was, so one of the things that these guys do when we're talking about the Shock Doctrine methods is, these are capitalists, all right? They may have a socialism element to it, but they're capitalists, first and foremost. And their movement was started by Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was a free market economist and really had a lot of ire for any sort of socialism or anything like that. And what he did was this: he created something that called the model. And what the model involved was slashing essentially all social programs to get down to the bare bones of pure capitalism, because he really believed in the capitalistic model. The problem was, for every country that they instituted these changes, it really wiped out the wealth of the people and brought a lot of misery. So I want to go into a couple examples here. So in the 90s, when Russia kind of fell, when they really took a hit, Russia cut nearly all social programs. And they really destroyed a lot of institutions. And what they did was they sold off utilities like the power company, the water company, and so on, to private corporations. So the government really disbanded and they sold everything off to private corporations. Now you might think, okay, what is the difference between the government running a utility and a corporation? A couple things, including how they did it. One thing is, they took the utility that, let's say, sold for maybe $2 million, $3 million, pennies on the dollar. Years later, 5-10 years later, the thing was worth $5 billion. Right, you get the idea.
The government created in Russia and then, I guess, potentially elsewhere, all these private sector billionaires.
That's exactly what they did. And these guys made millions and billions, and the people lost the utilities for pennies on the dollar. And in addition to Russia, again, this happened in Iraq, happened in New Orleans. They did this in the former Yugoslavia, in what's now Serbia. And really, what Milton Friedman created with this model was a crisis model. You wait for a crisis, and then you move in, take advantage of the region when people are still sort of reeling, back on their heels, unable to defend themselves, unable to really think about anything outside of survival. And while people are under these harsh conditions, unable to defend themselves and their government's policies, the corporations move in, sweep up the wealth and the opportunity to continue to make money and expand their corporate power, and the governments let them do it. So that brings me to my next point, which is the virus. So at this point, we've reviewed what the intentions of these global players are and some of the sort of nefarious methods they use to get what they want, right? They capitalize on disaster. Naomi calls it disaster capitalism. That brings me to the virus. So you probably know where I'm heading with this.
I would think so. But we've heard a lot about the businesses that are struggling in the midst of the economic, disaster that's been a result of the, of the virus. But who are the companies that are benefiting from what's happening?
Well, I don't know necessarily who's benefiting this minute. We know that the online retailers are benefiting. We know that the banks are benefiting, people trying to take out more loans because they're losing their own personal wealth. They're losing their own income. So the big power players are certainly not losing money on this. But I think that the lockdown during this pandemic, the lockdown response, although maybe helping some entities, really they're thinking long-term big picture here, which is once we get over this hump of the lockdown, as Klaus Schwab said, they want to change our structure so that when we resume normal, there is no normal. There is no normal. As Klaus said, everything, including ourselves is going to change. And that's what they're banking on here, is that going forward with this new model of the world, they're now positioned to make more wealth than ever before.
So what is the new world model, a post-virus world model after the lockdown?
Well, what they're looking to do is what we've been looking on the lookout for such a long time, which is they're looking to replace humans with machines. And they discuss this in depth. We're talking about both AI, artificial intelligence, and non-AI technology. Automation, that's what we've been on the lookout for. And unfortunately, like I said, they're looking to create a different monetary system. They're looking for a digital system. And that does a few things, but one of the things it does that is concerning to me and a lot of other people is it creates a system of centralized monetary control. Now, pause that for a second. China right now has what they call a social credit score or a social credit system. So we all have credit scores.
Sure.
They have a social credit score. And what does that mean? What that means is because they live under essentially an authoritarian government in China, there's not much freedom. If the government says no, you better not, or you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Because they live under that system, there's a lot of rules, regulations, and the government exerts tight control over its people. Well, what they do is, in order to incentivize people to comply and conform and to play their game the way they want, they will give you a score. And that score is going to be based on things including your compliance with the system. And if you resist in any way, you can go to prison, you can go to these internment camps, and they kill people as well. They don't like to advertise that, but they do. It's well documented.
You saw that with the doctor in China that tried to warn everybody about the dangers of the coronavirus.
That's right.
And they essentially forced him to take back this warning at gunpoint and say that he was wrong and that, you know, they had the situation under control. Unfortunately, he died of the coronavirus. And even more unfortunately for the world, those warnings went unheeded by both the Chinese and the international community.
Yeah, so they don't play around over there. So the virus. It looks to me like they're using the virus the way they use these other disasters, using this disaster capitalism model outlined in the Shock Doctrine. They're using the virus to essentially create disaster, to put us back on our heels, and to bring down our economy so that we have to bring it up again. And when we go to bring it up again, just like I read from Klaus Schwab, he doesn't want to bring it up in the same manner as before. He wants to do it using this new format, this new model. He wants to use he wants to get started with the fourth industrial revolution, which means that when you go back to your factory, you're not going back to your factory. You're being replaced by a robot. And what Klaus talks about when he refers to this 50% of U.S. jobs being lost forever, he says we have to reskill and upskill. What he's essentially saying is you need to move into a new job, a new industry, and you have to do it quick. To me, that sounds like pie in the sky. To me, that sounds like a fantasy. And to me, I think he actually doesn't believe that can happen. I think that he realizes, and I could be wrong, that America is going to take a big hit from this, and we really don't have much recourse. That this is going to knock us back for quite a while, and it's going to take a while for us to get moving with a nice head of steam in this new model. Now, the corporate structures will make money almost off the get-go. They already have these systems in place ready to go. But I don't know if you have another job waiting for you, but I don't. So
if I'm replaced by a robot, then we're going to have a tough time paying the mortgage here.
That robot better have good diction. So, the virus. Now, the reason that I'm skeptical of the virus is for a couple reasons. Number one, we've got this model of disaster capitalism. We know that these corporations capitalize on disaster. They see it, they see the opportunity, they move in, if not create it. On top of that, so we know that these corporations like to take advantage of disaster, and they make money doing it. The second thing that concerns me is that everything we've been doing in response to the virus doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And the directives are coming from the World Health Organization, which is linked to the United Nations. The United Nations is in lockstep and is fully committed to this great reset that Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum have laid out.
You mean there's not a lot of science that says if you shut down indoor dining at 10 p.m. that people will stop getting the virus?
I didn't see that study. If you find that, send it my way.
I'm still looking.
So I'm going to go through some interesting information pertaining to the virus. So the New York Times, a couple months ago, about 3 months ago, published an article which was very, very illuminating. And I'm going to read some stuff to you. All right. If you haven't seen this article, this is very, very interesting. It makes you wonder why our government is doing what it's doing. So in this New York Times article, the author interviewed a lot of physicians, a lot of doctors, usually prominent individuals at University of Southern California, Harvard, etc. Right? The sort of who's who of educational and institutions in the United States. So this is a quote by Dr. Michael Mina. He's an epidemiologist, right? He deals with diseases at Harvard. And what he says is this. He's speaking about the PCR test, by the way, that we've been using to test for COVID-19. And he says, we've been using one type of data for everything, and that is just plus or minus. That's all, meaning positive or negative test. What he says is, it's really irresponsible, I think, to forego the recognition that this is a quantitative issue. And he recommended setting, well, I'll get into that. But what he's talking about here is that the test doesn't tell you how sick the person is, if at all. What it's measuring is the amount of sort of viral components being measured in the mucus of the individual, but it says nothing. It says there's presence, yes or no. It says nothing about how much and how concerning that is.
One person could be hospitalized due to the coronavirus. One person could recover from it in 3 days, and the test shows the exact same result.
That's exactly right. And he goes on here. So what they did with these PCR tests that they're using for COVID-19 is they can adjust the sensitivity of the testing device. All right, I won't go into details, but what they've done is they've set the test sensitivity at a very high number. And I won't elaborate, but they set the tests at 40 and sometimes at 37. All right. And what Dr. Michael Mina of Harvard here says, he recommended setting the tests at 30, not 37 or 40, which is what they've been doing, 30 or even less. And the reason is, if you set these tests too high, if you calibrate the sensitivity too high, there is going to be 100-fold to a 1,000-fold amplification of the genetic material of the virus, and the test is going to read a positive when it shouldn't. So, in essence, what he's saying is...
We saw that with Elon Musk just recently. He went for a test, 4 times in the same day. Twice he was negative, twice he was positive. What sort of real information do you gain from inconsistent results like that?
Very little, other than there's something weird going on, which is what his tweet said.
Right.
So what Dr. Mina said was these tests should be set at 30 or 35, not 37 or 40, and that's going to change the outcomes a lot. Now, we've been tracking the number of cases in this country since the beginning, and as well as the world's. These tests are contributing to the number of cases.
Sure.
All right, so we have to keep that in mind. And what he's saying is this is irresponsible to classify someone as having this disease without a quantification in place, meaning how many viral components are in this person, and are they actually going to get sick from it or not? So what I'm going to go into now is pretty concerning, raises a lot of questions. What the New York Times did was they commissioned a lab, the New York State lab, to go back to some of the tests that they had taken in and had confirmed were positive tests, and they asked the lab to go back and retest those samples under different conditions. And this is what they realized. In 3 sets of testing data that include cycle thresholds, meaning they're now analyzing and accounting for the sensitivity levels that they set, whereas before they weren't doing that. And what they said was these 3 samples were from Massachusetts, New York, and from Nevada. And the conclusion of the New York State lab was that up to 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus.
Wow.
Up to 90%.
Wow.
That's a huge difference.
Do you know if that held true in the other states?
I don't know. This particular study only covered those 3.
Gotcha.
We have other studies, though. So I'm actually going to elaborate on that particular study. So in July, that lab identified 872 tests, and the test had been set at 40, like we said. Well, if they were to, when they retested these samples, if they were to retest them and set the test at 35, 43% of those people would be tested negative.
Wow. So because it was at 30, you had all these folks getting a positive result.
Because it was at 40, they brought it down to 35.
Understood.
So only reduction of 5, you lose 43%. If instead you drop it to 30, you lose 63%. So that means that 37%, just over 1/3 of those that had tested positive in those 3 states, actually would not have been considered positive if the test had been set and calibrated at an appropriate number. And that number has been corroborated by all these physicians in here. I can go through 3, 4, 5 different people interviewed saying the same thing. I can't believe they did this. Why would they do this? This is unconscionable. This doesn't make any sense. This is not good science. And yet this is what they did. These are doctors, elite doctors. In Massachusetts, between 85 and 90% of people who tested positive in July at a setting of 40 would not be positive at a setting of 30. And remember, 30 is what these doctors often recommend. So what this is telling us is when these high-level physicians, if they were put in a position to determine how sensitive these tests should be set, somewhere between 85 to 90, maybe as low as 63% of these would be thrown out as negative. That's profound.
That definitely is profound.
That's profound. We've been looking at these rates in the millions, and we're realizing it's not in the millions, it's in the hundreds of thousands.
Right. It all depends on what level of sensitivity produces a positive result.
That's right. So at this point in the conversation, we have to ask ourselves if there's something fishy going on here. And I think a lot of Americans have a sense that there is, but we're not quite sure what that is. I want to point out another thing that we all remember, the H1N1 pandemic.
Sure.
All right, of years ago. It wasn't that long ago. What was that, maybe 2009 or so,
right,
give or take? Well, in 2009 or 2010, Forbes magazine published an article, and the title of the article was "Why the World Health Organization Faked the Pandemic." And the article details how the World Health Organization raised a red flag. I believe it was 2009, maybe 2008. And they said, this is going to become a global pandemic, referring to the H1N1 virus.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Who was head of the World Health Organization at the time, used the term, this is all of humanity under threat. Something like to that effect.
Well, in hindsight, it was a bit of a farce because what they did was they created a huge opportunity for the drug companies because the pharmaceutical companies had contracts with the World Health Organization in different countries. And the contracts were this. If there was a pandemic declared, they had the contract to manufacture the vaccines. So the World Health Organization was then brought under scrutiny, and they were investigated. And they were investigated by multiple European organizations for fraud. And the conclusions of the body that investigated them was that there were conflicts of interest between the within the World Health Organization and the pharmaceutical companies that they'd given these contracts to, because it was apparent that they had exaggerated the scope of this virus. They manufactured millions upon millions of vaccines that were never used, and yet the companies got paid. The pharmaceutical companies got paid. So we know that these world players are not above fraud.
So
And
that's an example of the shock doctrine.
that's
Potentially.
definitely an example of the shock doctrine of something scary, something concerning, something worrying. People are concerned and
Right.
frightened.
Crisis, and then private sector company jumps in to solve the crisis. They do very well in lining their own pockets, not necessarily that well in actually solving the crisis.
That's it. They're good at making money. So
where do we go from here?
So at this point, it looks to me like, and we just sort of laid this out, that this thing is bogus. We know the virus is real. People have died from it. People have gotten sick from it. People have gotten hurt from it. People have really gotten sick. However, based on this New York Times article and all of this information we're finding out about these laboratories, we've been sold this story that this pandemic is that this virus is affecting so many of us. And the fact is that when we see these things like climbing case rates and so on, the numbers so far seem to be heavily exaggerated. And that's why the death rates, the death numbers are a much more relevant metric when trying to determine how at risk we are and how we should respond to this. And what we've realized is that although the media, which is part of this whole thing, the media are owned by a few corporations, not many, and those corporations are global stakeholders, as Dr. Schwab refers to them, and they have something to gain from this. So the media has been pushing this narrative of this horrible, deadly, scary virus, and yet when we look at the death statistics, we realize that the deaths are actually heavily in the 65 and older age range. All right. Now, not to say I'm wishing death on any of my older friends or relatives, but the fact is that the three gentlemen in this room right now are not at a high risk of any sort of significant injury nor death from this virus.
Right. We could probably go to a Thanksgiving with 10 or more people, and chances are maybe even get the virus and survive.
Hypothetically.
Yeah.
Hypothetically.
So let me ask you this, Josh. So you talk about the global stakeholders and the media as one of those global stakeholders. Up until recently, the internet was a really great thing in that you could find alternative points of view. Now we're seeing, websites like YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, actually censoring and in many instances banning people that are putting out opinions, information, and news that's contrary to what public health authorities say. What does that say about where we are as a country, as a society, as a world? How does that play into the shock doctrine? And what are these big tech companies gaining by censoring alternative points of view? I was always of the view that, if you don't agree with someone's opinion, maybe put your own opinion out there and explain why you don't agree. Now there's no opportunity to do that with, sites like YouTube, Google, and so forth.
Well, this is sort of my personal assessment, my personal opinion. The big media companies, many of these corporations that make it to the world level, this international level, sort of work together. It's always in the best interest of all parties involved to work together whenever possible, to sort of form a bit of a coalition. And that tends to happen with the big corporations, with the media companies, the social media companies. And it appears that the social media companies have been choking off any sort of dissent when it comes to the virus, what the virus is about, how we should respond to the virus, and so on. And what's so worrisome, like you just said, Frank, was that they've been ramping up to the point of, it's out of control, where they're censoring anything, nearly anything that goes against this official narrative that we've been told by our government, by the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the media. And unfortunately, right now, it looks like the corporations versus the world. And that's sort of where we are at this point. It's the corporations that stand to make a lot of money and to gain a tremendous amount of power versus the citizens of the world. And we see all these countries, France and Germany, the United States and Australia and Serbia, protesting in the streets against abuses of government, against the lockdowns, against there's at least a dozen major negative side effects of these lockdowns, everything from health to mental health to the economy, and yet they're not backing down, which tells you where their priorities are.
So what do we think the solution is? I mean, I think most people watching this, they don't want their friends, their relatives, or themselves to get this deadly virus and die from it, but they also don't want to, go into a 6-month lockdown or some version of a 6-month lockdown, which involves their kids not being in school, them not being able to go to a gym or to a restaurant. And they also value things like free expression and free exchange of ideas. So what is the solution? Where do we go from here? How do we get out of this as an individual? What does one do to kind of stand up and say, I'm not okay with what the global elites, whether they're governmental or private sector corporate elites, I'm not okay with what they're saying is the only way to handle this.
That's the big question. Personally, I voted for Donald Trump the first time for reasons akin to this. I voted for him the second time for this reason, because I know that he stands up for the United States. I know that he protects the United States against losses at the international level, right? He truly has tried and has largely succeeded in helping the economy of the United States against these. Well, right now, his presidency is in question as the voting and the counting of the votes is still going on. And there's a lot of legal cases in court right now pertaining to considerations about fraud and so on. I'm hoping that he can get into office and continue to defend the United States against the vacuum of this global power, because the Democrats are fully committed to this. The other part of this is we still have a real virus. How do we respond? I think the most prudent way to respond to this is to ask our dear loved ones, friends and family, that may have some sort of sickness, comorbidity, that makes the virus way more potentially deadly for them, as well as maybe our older relatives, because again, we've seen that the death rates are at about 80% in the group 80% of the deaths are in the 65 or older group. So I would ask, until this virus resolves, that our more sickly friends and our friends over the age of 60, 70, really continue to be very cautious. Perhaps stay home, certainly wear a mask when they're out, and continue to be as healthy as possible. And I think the rest of us need to go back to work. We have to get the economy going again, because if we don't, it will continue to get worse. And if Trump doesn't get into office, it looks like we're going to fall into the hands of this global group. And if that happens, we are going to have the biggest unemployment problem this country has ever seen.
Well, and not to mention the related issues of, the public health issues that, you and that New York Times article and other health professionals have cited as a result of the lockdown. I mean, even the UN said we could see really serious public health implications as a result of the lockdown itself.
Right. That's right.
Irrespective of the virus.
In addition to the virus, the projections for starvation in the world, because when people don't work, they don't eat. The world projections for starvation is that in not too long a time, we may expect to see 240 million people starve to death, mostly in the third world.
Wow.
And what is so absurd about that is that it's not in response to the virus, it's in response to the lockdown.
Wow.
And right now, the world death total as of November 14th, Saturday today, is we've got a count of 1.26 million deaths worldwide from the lockdown.
You compare that to 240 million deaths as a result of the lockdown.
That's 180 times more deaths from lockdown than from virus.
Wow.
So that means for every one person dying from a virus, 180 people starve. in order to protect those people. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense for a government that's looking out for the good of its people. And I would say clearly our government and the governments of the people of the countries partaking in this are not looking out for the good of their people, and instead I think they're eyeing that move to globalism and this fourth
turning. What's the
word I'm looking for?
Industrial Revolution.
Industrial Revolution and the Great Reset. So at this point, we have to defend our country, and we have to try to push this off as much as we can and hope that we have a leader that will defend us at the world level and not throw us to the dogs, so to speak.
Well, you've given, I think, folks a lot to think about. I think you've given them a lot to learn and a lot to build upon.
Well, that's it, folks. Frank, thank you so much
Thank you, Josh,
for coming on. And I thank you guys for watching.
You too much.
We'll see you next time for episode 2. Take care.